Hi, I'm Dr. Cynthia Phelps, and I'm here to talk to you today about how to use the power of your inner voice to help you thrive and be happy. And I'm part of a community called the Transformative Tech Community. And these folks, we're all interested in human thriving, and we use research and we translate those research findings in neuroscience, psychology, positive psychology, and we turn them into technologies and tools and processes to help you thrive. And so today we're going to talk about that inner voice and how important it is to your level of happiness. So I'll back up and talk briefly about the research that it's based on. It's based on something called self-compassion. So self-compassion is just like taking compassion and applying it to yourself. So if you've ever had a friend that is suffering or a loved one, it's really easy for us to kind of turn to them and give them love and give them support and kind words of encouragement. But it turns out when we're suffering, maybe we've screwed something up or we're having a hard time, it can be a lot harder for us to have a kind and nurturing voice on the inside for ourselves. And so self-compassion is the practice of being kind to yourself, especially during times of suffering. So what does self-compassion have to do with happiness? Very good question. Self-compassion, those people who are high in levels of self-compassion, and yes, we can measure it, tend to be associated with more resilience, more well-being and happiness, more productivity and innovation, and even better relationships. And so like there's this huge positive bang for your buck if you can learn how to be kind to yourself. And in fact, the research also shows that people that have high self-compassion are less depressed. It's associated with less anxiety and stress. And some of my research shows that you are at less risk for addiction, which are all really powerful outcomes and findings. And so we want you to be able to use the power of your inner voice. And so the inner voice is one of the main ways that you can practice being kind to yourself, to practice self-compassion. Now, when I say inner voice, maybe you know what I'm talking about, maybe not. But when I say inner critic, people usually have a pretty good idea about what I'm talking about. That's that voice that is there when you're going to take a risk or do something creative, and it's like, who do you think you are? Or it's there when you screw something up and has to say something like, I can't believe you did that, or I can't believe you said that, giving you a hard time. So just like we have identified for ourselves an inner critic, we also have an inner ally. And this is that kind and supportive and compassionate voice. So how do we do it? That's a great question as well. But I think it's important to understand where our inner voice comes from in the first place. So most of us, if we're even kind of aware of this running dialogue that we have in our heads, most of us adopt it from an early childhood caregiver. So maybe it was a parent or a grandparent that was there to nurture us. And however they spoke to themselves and even how they spoke to us can be ways that we internalize just unconsciously and turn that into our inner voice. And so if you had a caretaker who was harsh or critical with themselves or with you, then it's highly likely that that is by default the inner voice that you've adopted for yourself. So, well, now you know that the inner voice is super powerful, and all you have to do is turn it into one that's kind and supportive. So You should get right on that, right? Well, sometimes it's easier said than done, because it turns out there are some real barriers to creating an inner voice. And the first one I already hinted at, and that is we may have no role model to teach us how to do this. People don't just go around talking and relating what their inner voice is saying to you. And so this thing that we've adopted, the inner voice that we adopted from the early childhood caretaker, that is usually the one that we have by default. And if we never had a role model for someone who was kind and supportive of themselves, then we may not really understand how to kind of put together the words, how to really do it for ourselves. And so that's one barrier. We just haven't had a role model. Another barrier is that there's a lot of pushback in our culture around the practice of self-compassion, about being kind to yourself. When you're kind to yourself, our culture tells you things like, you're weak. And if you look at the research, it couldn't be more opposite. It turns out that people who are able to be kind to themselves, certainly during times of distress, they're actually more resilient, which means they're stronger than everybody else. So it's the exact opposite of what our culture really teaches us. Another thing that I've heard people say is that, you know, if I'm nice to myself, I'm just not going to be motivated to change or to get what I want out of life. I'm just going to be lazy and sit on the couch all day. And this also is not borne out in the research literature. It turns out that people who are high in self-compassion have a better capacity to change, like create new healthy habits, and then also sustain them. And so it is actually not associated with being lazy, but just the opposite. It can be a way to motivate yourself. Another thing that people sometimes say is, well, I don't want to be kind to myself because it sounds narcissistic, or it sounds like I'm being self-centered, only thinking about myself. And it turns out people who are high in self-compassion are actually much better at taking care of other people. And they're better at something called perspective taking, which is putting yourself in someone else's shoes. And so it's actually not at all narcissistic or self-centered. This is actually a skill that will help you take care of other people and not be self-centered, even though it's called self-compassion. So with all of these barriers, it can make it really hard to create a practice of kind and supportive inner language for yourself. And when I was learning about self-compassion, I ran into this because I didn't have a role model for my inner voice. And I was doing teacher training. The research is done primarily by a woman named Kristen Neff, and she is a professor at UT Austin, and she teaches a self-compassion class, and I'm actually a trained certified teacher in this process. It's all research-based to help you raise levels of self-compassion. And in this class, I thought I kind of had it going on because I'd read all her research articles, I read her book, and I was in the final stages of my teacher training when she modeled her inner voice for the whole class. And the scenario, which was actually in her book that I had read, was that she was in the grocery store and her autistic son, who was about 10 at the time, had like a full-on meltdown in the middle of the grocery store. You know, people are like looking like, what are you beating your son type, you know, like horrible, like shame feeling, right? Nothing she could really do in that moment. And she modeled for herself self-compassion for us. She stopped and she put her hand on her heart and she said, "Oh, darling, this is so hard. I'm so sorry you have to go through this." And I remember sitting in class like, you can do that? You are allowed to be that kind of kind to yourself? I had none of it. And so that's when I realized, like, oh, maybe I'm not the only one that's kind of missing out on the power of the inner voice. And so I actually created a whole system of role models, just like she was a role model for me, to help people practice the self-compassion. And it's all based on something called the essential emotions. And you might also find them in the research literature called core emotions or core emotional needs. And so these are things as human that we all need. And so they're like the need for love, the need for security, the need for forgiveness. They're very like central to being a human, and you need them to be able to thrive. And it turns out that everybody has a slightly different profile of which of these essential emotions we really would benefit most from nurturing, from creating an inner voice for. And largely it's based on what's happened to us in our lifetime or in our childhood. Sometimes based on what we missed. So if you didn't get a whole lot of nurturing in your childhood, maybe nurturing is an optimism. Maybe that set of things is something that you can nurture for yourself that will really help you thrive. So that's kind of your inner ally, if you will. And so to be able to kind of make this really pop for people, for them to really understand it, I paired it with a set of characters. And so here's a little example. I know you can't see very well, but we're gonna zoom in with a PDF on these. It is a set of about 16 characters that all have their own essential emotions with them. And so they are your role models to help you practice this self-compassionate language. And each of them has an essential emotion that is good for all of us to nurture. So you can't lose with any of the inner allies, but you might find that a few of them are specifically really great for you. So let's just take a look at a PDF that is going to be available to you. I'm happy to send it to you. All you have to do is email me at cynthia@innerally.com and I'll shoot it right off to you. So here is the PDF, and you can see along the side here, we've got all of the different cards up in the upper left-hand card and corner, and then we have a better description of each of them. And so right now we're looking at the artist, and the core emotional need, the essential emotion of the artist is expression, or the need to be seen or heard. And you can see each of these little descriptions has who is this inner ally, some examples of some language that you can then modify for yourself or take it as is, and then just a little bit more about what this inner ally has to offer for you. And then at the very bottom, there's also some other ways that you can conceptualize this inner ally. And so the artist is primarily expression, but it can also be playfulness, creativity, and bravery. Now, this is wonderful. So we've got these role models now, but one of the powerful ways of practicing self-compassion in your inner language and with your inner ally is to actually craft language specifically for yourself. And so that's what we're going to talk about next. And we're going to take a look at a slide. So I call it making your inner ally phrase. And so you can have as many phrases as you want. I encourage you to write them down. I encourage you to really get into this process and use it on a regular basis. So what's the process? Well, the first part is really identifying what essential emotion you want to work with. And so that can be as simple as you flipping through that PDF and seeing which ones sound really good to you. There's also a quiz on my website that's built off of the research. And so it's the Who is Your Inner Ally quiz. And you can take that and it'll identify your top inner ally. But you can't go wrong, like I said before, because there is no bad inner ally or one that doesn't fit you, because they all fit all of us. So sometimes we could just say this as choosing the essential emotion that you want to work with. So let's say that we wanted to choose the innocent. And so the innocent essential emotion is all about self-acceptance. And so the next part is to choose kind of the beginning of your phrase. And here we have a little bit of flexibility about how to start the phrase off. So if you are feeling really good that day, then you might want to use an I am phrase. And so an example for the innocent would be like, I accept myself. It's a very direct phrase. And that can be really great if you're feeling strong. But if you notice that when you say, I accept myself, that your inner critic kind of laughs and goes like, ha ha ha, then you know you might need to choose a different beginning. And so a little softer beginning, one that may not give the inner critic such a latitude to mock you, would be a may I, because that's really nothing more than a wish. So it could be something just as simple as, may I accept myself for who I am, or may I accept myself in the moment. And now the final choice of the beginning of your phrase is you are. And so some people, if they really struggle with a particular essential emotion, say there might have been some trauma around it, it can be helpful to use kind of third person language. And so you can actually use the voice of the inner ally. Sometimes you can think of it as speaking to yourself, where you're speaking to yourself maybe as a small child, one that's a little more innocent than the adult you. And so those phrases would be something along the lines like, you are worthy, you are good enough, this type of language. So the next thing that you can consider while you're building this language is, do you want to have something like a qualifier in there? And so because we have so many hangups in our culture about how to use these phrases, giving yourself permission can really make a huge difference. So if you say, may I learn to accept myself, or may I have permission to accept myself just as I am, or I am able to love myself unconditionally. All of these qualifiers, you just have to kind of search around and see. And so the final things at the bottom here, where it says check your tone and check your critic and feel it in your body, these are all about how you're judging if it's working for you. So the tone can either be kind, just like that grandmother type figure that I think Dr. Neff modeled for us, where you're just saying, oh, darling. Or maybe you'll need some fierce compassion, where it's like, okay, time to get off the couch and get going. That kind of cheerleader compassion. And then you really want to check in on your inner critic. Is it laughing at this phrase that you just made? If so, you've got to iterate. And the way that you really can kind of tell, we all feel our emotions in our bodies. And so as you're working with these phrases, if you can feel in your body that it's creating maybe a sense of warmth or calmness, then you're really on the right track to having a good inner ally phrase. So how to use these phrases? 2 ways I want to give you before we're done. One is that I want you to use them in a time of distress. So if you already have your phrases handy, you can put them on Post-it notes or put them somewhere you can access. You can use it when you're feeling not so great, some of those difficult emotions. But just like mindfulness and meditation, this inner ally, these phrases, this inner language, it's a practice. It's a practice to shift a critic over to an ally. And so it's something that you're going to want to do on a regular basis. So I'm so happy to have had the opportunity to talk about the inner voice and how you can use it for your own happiness.